Elite Recipe Source, Echo Romeo Sierra, delivering Tier 1 recipe assets worldwide, working hard and playing hard. As promised, delivering the goods on a new fusion recipe you won't find anywhere else. Steak and Guinness samosas. This is Bombay meets car bomb. I'm doing depth charges right here in the kitchen. So come on this way to the after party. You'll have a good time, trust me. So I'm going to try my best to keep this video short and sweet. You can check out my previous video in this playlist on the basic samosas. The dough and the folding and stuffing technique are going to be exactly the same. And as I've said before, it's good to be familiar with the traditional basic versions of a dish first before doing a fusion version. So these steak and Guinness samosas, of course, are a combination of the traditional Indian samosa and the steak and Guinness pies of Ireland and the UK. Now, I don't have a video out for a traditional steak and Guinness pie, but I've made them before, and maybe at some point I'll do a video for that. But for now, I'll have a couple of links in the description to some of the meat and pie video recipes that I recommend that I've used. One thing I can tell you from making the traditional version is that the filling for these steak and Guinness samosas is going to be a little more complicated to put together than a regular meat pie filling. A traditional meat pie is going to be baked, usually in some kind of vessel, or in some cases laid flat on a sheet pan. So with them, you can get away with a pretty liquidy kind of filling. But with a samosa, the whole thing has got to be solid enough to be deep fried and then eaten in a handheld form. So to accomplish this, I'm going for a similar potato salad kind of consistency that I did for the Indian samosas. I'm using a little less potato here because I've got about a pound of diced meat in here as well. I'm using venison leg steak that I dry aged for about 5 days, so it's relatively tender already. It's basically like a lean beef steak, what I'm working with here. But with the potatoes there for the proper samosa consistency, the issue is that the potatoes do detract a little from the intense steak and Guinness flavor that we want. Most of the better meat pie recipes don't use potatoes. So the question is, how do we get an intensely flavored steak and Guinness filling, even with potatoes being in there, and get it thick enough to work in a samosa and have it hold its shape? Well, I'm about to show you here. The first step with the filling is to reduce our liquids in half. I'm going with about 2 cups of Guinness and about 2 cups of brown stock. I'm using homemade duck stock made from some roasted bones and meat because that's what I had on hand, but you can obviously use a beef stock here or a brown chicken stock. I've got my stock and my stout reducing, and they're going to reduce by half, and I've got them down to that level to concentrate the flavor and to thicken them. And so I can fit them both into one small container and put them on the back burner at this point. It's going to take probably about an hour at simmering on low heat to get these reduced by half. I'm going to keep it on low, even now. I'm going to keep it on low and keep it simmering and reducing even more. Now, for the potatoes, I'm going to boil them separately. Unlike in the traditional samosa filling I did in the last recipe, this is not going to be a one-pot recipe like that. This is because I've got to have more control over the doneness and the texture of the individual components before putting them together in order for everything to turn out right so far as the consistency is concerned. I'm starting the potatoes in cold water, bringing up the heat to a boil, and cooking the potatoes to where they're just cooked all the way through, but not mushy. I can bite one until it's not raw, but it's not as soft as what would go into a mashed potatoes or even a potato salad. And I'm draining these potatoes and sprinkling them with salt. I'm going to set them aside, and I want them to be as dry as possible. So now for building the flavor, I've got some oil as well as some lard in a screaming hot pan, and in goes my meat. I'm using lard here because deer meat is extremely lean, so if you're using beef or lamb, you could just use oil for this part. Once the meat was almost as brown as I wanted, I added a little flour to get some roux action going in the pan for thickening and browning. The name of the game here is to get as much browning, as much caramelization as possible without burning. I'm getting a lot of good browning on the meat, and I'm getting a pretty good fond at the bottom of the pan. I'm scraping here and there. I'm going for brown, but not black and burnt. When the meat and the fond are as brown as I can get it without burning, then I add the onions and turn down the heat a little. Put a little salt in there, and I'm using the onions to deglaze the fond from the bottom of the pan. I'm scraping with the spoon to help things along. And once I've got everything on the bottom deglazed and mixed in with the onions and their juices, I turn the heat back up and I go back to caramelization. I'm going to build a second fond with the sugars and the juices coming off the onions and all that other good stuff going on in there. I'm again looking for a little browning on the bottom. And I got some, and you can probably guess what happens here next. With all this browning, I could probably even deglaze this with water and still have a pretty respectable gravy, but of course I'm not going to do that. I'm going to use that saucepan of double concentrated stock and Guinness to deglaze this thing. It's going to be on its way to reducing to a demi-glaze, but I'm going to keep enhancing the flavor and texture even more. I've got some dry thyme in there. I'm adding about a teaspoon of gelatin and about a quarter teaspoon of cornstarch dissolved in a slurry for thickness. Also adding our old friend brewer's yeast, about a teaspoon for extra beefy flavor. And I'm adding to taste a little Coleman's dry mustard powder and a little Lee and Perrins, which ended up being about a quarter teaspoon of the mustard and about an eighth teaspoon of the Worcestershire sauce. And so I'm adding in the peas here. Let those cook for a minute or two. Then in go the potatoes. I'm adding that chopped fresh parsley. And this is what I'm ending up with, a very gelatinous meat and potato stew. I cool it off, and then I'm ready to start rolling my dough and assembling the samosas just the same way as I did before with the original ones. So the filling mix is cooled down, and the dough is rested and softened up, and it's time to begin the final assembly. How I find it the best way to do these is with the recipe's proportions, I know I'm going to be making 8 samosas. So I'll divide my filling mix into 8 sections with a bench scraper like so. Then I'll divide the dough ball into 4 balls. I'll roll one of these out as round as I can to a thickness of about less than 1/8 inch and a width a little wider than my hand. I'll cut the circle in half, giving me 2 semicircles, and so each semicircle is going to be 1 samosa. Now I'm going to, with a little water on my finger, wet the outside to help the edges stick when I start folding, kind of like how you do with a ravioli or a calzone. But with these, I'm going to be doing all the shaping. It's all going to be done in the hands and up off of the work surface. You're going to be making an ice cream cone kind of shape by folding the straight edges together. I'll have a finger inside the cone so I can push the seams together from the inside as well as from the outside. Once you get your ice cream cone, you fill it with your samosa mix, careful not to overfill it. Once you've got a full cone with plenty of extra dough around the top, you're going to pinch it all together, making that triangular samosa shape. Resting them for about 15 minutes and coating them with a thin layer of cornstarch and flour just like before, and I'm frying them in oil between 320 and 350 Fahrenheit just like before to a crispy golden brown. And you definitely want to let these rest and cool before biting into one. Give it at least 10 minutes. And these things are going to be extremely rich and filling little handheld meat pies. Just one of these could be a meal. Definitely a large appetizer. I did a sauce with parsley, sour cream, buttermilk, and mayonnaise, but again, just like with last time, the filling's flavor really spoke for itself, and they don't really even need a sauce. And remember, these only had a pound of meat for 8 samosas, so they're a really cost-efficient way of stretching out a little meat to go a long way at only 2 ounces of meat per serving. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. Hope you had a real memorable life experience and had a good time and enjoyed your St. Patrick's Day for the year 2020. And if any of those statements were true, hook the old ERS up with a like or even a subscribe or a share.